Everyone, I've got something exciting to share with you. I've got something new. Now, we all love gear. We're all gear hounds because we're photographers. And yes, there's stuff we want, but it seems infrequent that something really interesting comes along that really piques your interest. And I've got that right here. I just received from my friends at Nisi their new 15mm Sunstar lens. I'm just unboxing it right now. I just received it. I'm going to take it outside as soon as the sun comes out, might be a day or so. But I'm just testing it on the camera right now. And I have the Sony version. I'm also waiting for the Fuji version, so I'll be able to test it out on that as well. Now, this is a full frame lens. Obviously, on the Fuji, it's an APS-C. So this lens says 15mm. By the way, it's a little wider than that. It's about 14.5. What that means is if you're going to put it on an APS-C camera, instead of being 1.5 times, it's a little bit less. So it's actually about 24mm, or 22mm rather, on the Fuji cameras. So first impressions, well, the lens seems very well made. It's hefty. It's all metal construction. I've got everything that was in the box here. I've got a little manual, warranty cards, a little pouch here, and the lens hood. And something I really appreciate, this is an all metal lens hood. And to me, the lens hood is always, besides protecting lens flare from the sun, it's also the first line of defense if your lens gets banged. So if you hit the front of the lens and you have a metal hood like that, that's a great feature to have. So I'm just going to take off the lens cap. I'm going to put the lens hood on. The lens itself has a standard 72mm thread. So that means you can put regular 72mm filters on it, which is awesome for a lens this wide. And again, it's hefty. I believe it's about 1 pound, but it's not that big a lens also. In fact, if I take off the hood and compare it to the other wide-angle lens I've been using, this is the Sony 12-24. So when you see the two of them together, you can see it's much smaller. It's about half the size. So I'm going to put it on my camera. I'm not going to be able to shoot it right this second because it's a Sunstar lens and there's no sun out. But as soon as that happens, we're going to do that. What's very interesting about this lens, and I'm really excited to try out, is that what makes this lens different? Yeah, you can get a Sunstar in any lens if you go down to f20, f22. What's really unique about this lens that excited me when I heard about it was that this lens will create a Sunstar at any aperture, including all the way open. I can shoot this lens at f4 and get a Sunstar. And that's going to open some interesting possibilities, because what if I want to have the foreground out of focus and just the Sunstar? Could be really interesting. Something pretty much impossible to do prior to this. Okay, so I'm going to mount this on my Sony a7R III. There we go. And yeah, it's a nice tight fit. The lens isn't wobbling at all. One thing now, this is a manual focus lens. And don't let that scare you, because there's actually a lot of advantages of shooting manual focus when you're going very wide. However, in order to have your camera work with it, you need to go into the menu system and tell the camera to be able to shoot without a lens. You think, well, why? There's a lens on there. Well, there's no electronics communication about the aperture and the settings on the lens back into the camera. So the camera isn't talking to the lens, so you need to tell it that. So after you've got the camera set to be able to shoot without a lens so that everything will work, the other thing I like to do is to go in and set focus peaking on. And if you haven't used focus peaking, it's a great tool when you're shooting wide angle, because what it allows you to do is to see, as you change your focus, it shows you in the scene, wrapped around in a little bit of color, what's in focus and what's not in focus. And as you turn your focus dial on the front of the lens, you'll see that color moving back and forth. Really handy when you're shooting. Now, I took a manual focus lens to Italy a couple years ago. It was a 12mm lens, just for some kind of really wild architectural stuff in some small towns. And having the manual focus with the focus peaking was actually much easier than having the lens try to hunt to what's in focus. Now, that said, at 15mm or 14.5mm, your depth of field, even at a middle aperture, 5.6 or f8, is going to be pretty extreme. But if you wanted to get really close and have something in soft focus and then the background in focus, or vice versa, this is going to allow you to do that. But seeing exactly what is in focus is easier achieved with the focus peaking on. So on the front of the lens, we've got an aperture ring. Now, this is something that you're going to want to use your live view on because, again, since this is a manual lens, this information is not transmitted into the camera. So you might want to take a peek to see what aperture you're on because you're not going to see it in the viewfinder. And again, as I mentioned, we've also got the focus ring. As I turn these, what's very nice is they are very smooth. There's a very slight détente as you go through. You can feel it. It's not a click, but you can feel the little resistance as you go through each full stop. On the focus wheel, it's continuous and very smooth. Seems to be very well made. Again, very tight fit to the camera. But really what's going to be the proof is the results. So we're going to take this camera out. I'm going to shoot it outdoors and we'll see what we get. I'm back at Wawayanda State Park in northern New Jersey. Again, it's just 10 minutes from where I live in Warwick, New York. And I wanted to do a little bit more of a scientific test with the new Nisi Sunstar lens on the Sony a7R III. Now, there's some clouds. It's a little bit hazy. So for me to get some sun stars, I had to kind of put the sun peeking around one of the trees. But the first test I did was I shot all the full f-stops, 4, 5, 6, 8, 11, up to 22, to show you that, yes, you get a sun star on every one of those. Now, I was thinking about it, and is f4 really a realistic aperture when you're shooting landscapes? And the answer probably is probably no. It's going to open up different kinds of opportunities that I think will be interesting, kind of more designy things. And when I'm able to finally get a day that I can go into New York City, I think shooting around Times Square at night with this is going to be the time to try those more wide open apertures. So I'm going to test the sharpness under landscape conditions, and that's generally going to mean probably f8 up. So I'm going to try some shots with from f8 up to f22 and see if there's any change in vignetting, any chromatic aberrations, sharpness differences, anything like that. So down this trail a ways is an interesting kind of cascade, small waterfall kind of thing that's very pretty. So I'm going to go down there and let's take a look and see, do a test with kind of the middle apertures from f8 down to see how the sharpness holds up under those conditions. So let's go, because the wind's starting to pick up, and even though I have my earmuffs, it's getting cold again. So let's do this. I've got this really pretty kind of ice-covered cascade here in the river in the park. It's really very pretty. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a test. I'm going to start at f22, and I'm going to shoot the full stops down, f22 down to f8. I've got my timer set. I'm on a tripod. More of a realistic kind of landscape kind of photography I would do. And when I get back into the studio, I'll upload the images and I'll check the sharpness. On the top of the lens, on the front dial, you've got your focus distance, and it starts at 0.7 feet, which is the closest focus. And at 0.7 feet, your depth of field is going to be pretty narrow. Now, on the other hand, if I close it all the way down to infinity, generally that's going to cause a fall off in sharpness. I find the best place to be, if I'm going to be at f8, is probably be about the 5-foot focus point. Because if you look on the lens at 5 feet, you are pretty much in focus from about 2.5 feet to infinity. So I think that's probably a good space to be. Maybe cheat a little bit past 5 feet. But if you go much wider than that, again, the depth of field is going to start to compress because you're so close in order to do that kind of focus. So 5 feet or so, and again, this has got the old style markings on the lens where you see the aperture markings and the range that will be in focus. In fact, for example, if I were to go down to f16, I can get infinity. I can get from focus from 1 feet to infinity with this lens, just looking at that. So if you don't have focus peaking, or focus peaking isn't your thing, you can just go by this. And pretty much if you're out in the landscape, if you set this at, a little 5 feet or just a little bit past, you can be pretty sure that everything from about 3 feet to infinity is going to be in focus. So that'll make it really simple. So I'm going to get a couple more shots while I'm here, and I'm going to do that same test again, f8 up to f22, and let's see what it looks like. So the last thing I'm going to test while I'm here is I put filters on here. And again, that's one of the beauties of this lens. 15 millimeters, yet it accepts filters. I've got a circular polarizer. It's the Nissi Natural Enhanced Circular Polarizer filter. And then on top of that, I've got the 100 millimeter filter holder, which has a 3-stop ND filter on it. Because what I'm after is I'm going to get some blurry water flowing down through here. And one of the reasons for that is I think it'll be a good test or a good illustration of sharpness, because you'll have the flowing water, the blur of that, contrasting with the sharpness of the rocks and the ice and the moss around it. So that'll be the final test. Again, I'll do the same thing. I'll shoot from f8 or from f22 down to f8, and we'll see what we get. But so far, so good. The lens is a joy to use, and I'm having a lot of fun with it. So let's take a look at the results when we get back to the studio. So let's do a little summary of what I found using the new Nissi Sunstar lens. I was initially very excited to have a lens that could produce sunstars at any aperture from f4 all the way up to f22. I was curious to see how usable that feature was. After thinking about it, once I got out in the field, I realized that the number of times I'm going to use f4 in landscape photography approaches 0. However, I was more interested in my first test out in the field to see how the lens performed from f8 to f22. Yes, I did test the ability to create sunstars at all apertures, and I can tell you that from f4 to f22, it creates a sunstar, and they all look identical. Now, as I mentioned, what I was mostly after in my first field test was how the lens performed as a normal 15mm lens, and how well does the manual focus work in landscape photography. As expected, there are definite ways to get the most out of what this lens can do, and a few things to avoid. What I learned first was that for optimal focus over an entire scene with an aperture of f8 or smaller, the best place to set the lens focus is just past the 5-foot mark on the lens. The 5-foot mark is the last number on the lens before you hit infinity. With this distance selected, depending on your aperture, let's say you choose f8, everything from 3 feet away to infinity was in sharp focus. If you actually set the lens to the infinity mark, you actually lose some sharpness. That's something pretty universal and something in general that you want to avoid. Now, I shot the lens both bare and with a circular polarizer, and then I added a 3-stop ND filter. There was no decrease in quality adding any or all of the filters. And having a standard 72mm thread on the front of the lens was very handy for attaching filters. This is something I cannot do on my Sony 12-24, which requires the special Nissi ultra-wide filter kit to mount filters on. Now, I've used lenses like this in the past, and there are a few things that are common to this wide a lens. Yes, there's some distortion and loss of sharpness in the extreme corners. It's something I find myself typically cropping out anyway. If you're shooting directly into the sun and you have bare branches up in the corners, yes, you're going to get some chromatic aberration. Now, it's a real true torture test, but I found that the chromatic aberration was slight enough that just clicking on Lightroom's Remove Chromatic Aberration button immediately got rid of all of them. When I was first shooting outside, I got some rainbow flares on the lens, and then I realized I had touched the lens with my finger. I put some finger oil on the lens. Once I cleaned that off, most of it went away. Now, anytime you shoot directly into the sun, you may get a little bit of flare, but the coatings on the lens did a nice job of keeping that to a minimum. So what's the bottom line? This lens is a great performer, particularly when you consider the price. My one wish for the lens would be a focus lock, a little slider right here on the side of the lens that would allow me to pick a focus point and leave it there. Since I think for most of my uses, I'm going to be f8 to f16 at just past 5 feet, I think I'd probably leave the lens there for most of my landscape work. Since setting the lens at just past 5 feet at f8, everything from 3 feet to infinity is in focus, so probably don't need f22 very often. I'm still curious what I can do with this lens at f4. I'm thinking food photography would be really interesting because at f4, And close focus. You can focus up to 7/10 of a foot away. The depth of field is extremely narrow. Could make for some really interesting results. Also, I can't wait to get this thing into New York City, into Times Square, and shoot at night. I think the f4 there could make for some very interesting results and produce some sunstars from some of the specular lights. I'll get there as soon as I can. We just had 2 feet of snow, so I'm probably going to be delayed a week before I can get into the city. I'll post some images as soon as I get a chance. Bottom line, for just $579, this is a really nice, really interesting, and really fun lens that'll definitely stir your creative juices. Take a closer look, the Nisi f4 Sunstar lens. I'm Joe Brady. Thanks for watching. Hope to see you online again soon. Bye-bye.